Hi, everyone. We'll give a few minutes for more people to join before we begin, but thank you for joining.
We do. I think that was.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes to give other people a chance to join in case it's early on in their day.
Hello.
Hi, Andrea. Very happy to have you here.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got loads of people on the line, which is really, really exciting. Thank you all for joining. Andrea, would you like to say a few words of introduction?
Sure, I will. Thank you. So I just wanted to, I don't know, maybe frame why this is so critical to us at this time with the Water Funds Strategy Group, which is, I think, you know, a really impressive group of professionals all across the Conservancy. In every region in which we work, we are working on water funds, either as very established and leading programs like in Latin America, or in brand new programs like in India and Indonesia and Europe and China. So it's a big spread, and we're working in ever more complex ideas and environments. So we're not just working in local communities where we have a specific project or an offering to our community to improve both watersheds and water security, and we want to communicate effectively to engage them at the community level. But we're more and more we're working with very large organizations, global organizations, regional banks, large platforms of practitioners that span the globe. And it becomes more and more important that we actually do have the same central message and language that we can use. So when we speak to Coca-Cola in Mexico City or in Nairobi or in China or in their corporate offices, they hear the same things from us. And so the need for this community of communication professionals to guide us and to make sure that we're clear, compelling, and consistent across all of our work is ever more important. And as we all know, it's also really difficult to do that and then also be relevant in our local communities. So it's quite a trick. And I want to thank everybody who's been participating up to this date in getting this bit of material together, but especially Bianca, who's led us. And in particular, I want to defer to my great communication professionals. We stand in your debt for helping us thread the needle on this really big challenge of communicating at the scale that we're working today in the Conservancy and water funds. So with that, Bianca, away.
Thank you, Andrea. Well, I hope we do you proud. That's certainly the intention. And I'm very shortly going to hand over to Kit and Alex from Portland, who have worked tirelessly on this project. What they're going to do is talk through how we got to where we did, because the actual process we undertook is important. So you can see where our insights were drawn from, and then just talk through the messaging that we have landed on and let you know what the component parts of the toolkit are. Your feedback is important. Please, if you have questions or comments, pop them in the chat section of Zoom, and we will do our best to get to them while we're on this call. If we don't, we will address them in due course. These materials are live. They evolve, they are organic, so we will not just be firing these off and forgetting them. There are some components of them which can be tweaked right, on an ongoing basis, so your input is important into that. And so just bear that in mind as we go along, and we're really looking forward to sharing this with you and getting your input and feedback. And now I'm going to hand over to Kit.
Hello everyone, I'm Kit, consultant at Portland Communications, and I'm also here with my colleague Alex.
Hello everyone, I'm Alex, consultant at Portland Communication as well, and my area of expertise is to communicate global concept with fragmented realities.
So to outline this session, I'm first going to talk you through the process we worked with the Nature Conservancy on to develop this new communications toolkit, which we'll be taking you through. And then my colleague Alex is going to talk you through it in more detail, how you can use it day to day and kind of how it applies to your communications within and around water funds. So first off, I'm going to start by talking you through the development process for the toolkit. Coming into this process, the Nature Conservancy was really concerned with making this work for all water funds and all regions that they operate in. So they were really keen to make sure that this was an inclusive and collaborative process, bringing in as many of your colleagues and your internal and external stakeholders as we could as part of the process. This was really important because we wanted to understand not only the full range of how different water funds work in detail, including the stakeholders that you have to speak to, who the people are critical, who the critical people are for making water funds work, and the messages that you use to persuade them and bring them around and tell them how crucial it is, but also how the toolkit itself would be most practical and useful to you every day in the work that you do. So as Bianca referenced, a lot of what we will show you today is the tools are still open to some finessing, and we will be asking you for your feedback. We're really keen to hear what you think about it and any ideas for how we can move it further. So I'll get started now. So in terms of how we got here, there were 2 in-depth stages we did before we got to the final message grid and toolkit to ensure that this met your needs. First up, we did a comprehensive audit of existing information on materials around water funds. So that was existing materials on water funds across the world that the Nature Conservancy has created, the messaging that you already use in different parts of the world to talk about water funds, the internal and external stakeholders for different types of water fund who are critical to their success and how that's different at different points in the process, other stakeholders of definitions of water funds to understand how they differ to yours, as well as media mentions to understand what really cut through in terms of what we're saying and what things kind of got lost slightly when we're talking to non-expert audiences or people who are trying to keep things very short for media. We also looked at other major sustainability initiatives to see what we could learn from elsewhere and thought through some of the key terms and how they looked in different languages. Once that was done, we then moved across to a process of consultation and co-creation. So this began with 5 interviews with communication specialists within the Nature Conservancy focused on water funds, understanding their objectives and what their goals were for the process as a whole, what the communication challenges were that there are around communicating around water funds and how this can potentially help, and also what this might potentially run into as obstacles, and also for the kind of core defining features of a water fund, which it was really important that we nailed down and put at the center of any definition that we settled on. This was followed up then by surveying a wider group of water fund staff to review the existing messaging that you already have in place, prioritize some of the audiences across different water funds, and then also test some of the language that we are already using for accessibility, especially when we're talking to some of the non-expert audiences who are really pivotal in getting water funds to work on the ground in a day-to-day way. After then bringing that all together and drafting some key messages, that was then followed up by a Nature Conservancy messaging workshop in Seattle, led by Bianca. And after that, a further set of refining and development interviews with people from across the organization to kind of get us to a point where the things that came out of that workshop really felt like they were working and they were kind of in the right voice and in the right spirit for the Nature Conservancy. Finally, we then went to some of your external partners who you work with very closely on running water funds, as well as some of the kind of outside corporates who are a really big part of making sure that they work and kind of scaling water funds in the longer term, to make sure that it was something that kind of chimed with their understanding of it, of why they're important and how they work, to make sure that the messaging works for people outside as well as for us. So that's how we got to the messaging grid. And it does sound like a lot of stages, but we wanted a really thorough process here to make sure it sounded authentically TNC and was nature focused, while also speaking to the broad range of work that lots of different water funds do in different places in the world. So turning to what this process showed, the first thing we found during our research was that there are a number of competing definitions that we use for water funds, and even more when you consider the definitions that other people use. We have a selection of the most central ones here, but what we found was that they varied in terms of their language, their length, and their complexity and tone from place to place and kind of group to group. Each of these had their strengths, but we wanted to take the best of each of these, but also get internal and external input and feedback to see how we could improve them even further. And this became one of the core motivations for this work, as we've already spoken to, which is making sure that we're speaking with one voice about water funds globally, wherever we are. So then we conducted some research in the survey looking at the core definition of water funds with the Nature Conservancy staff. And this showed that there were clear areas of improvement where we could build on the existing definition. So only 6% of you that we spoke to thought it was concise. A minority, there was also more than half of you thought that it didn't explain the benefits well. So there was more work to do in bringing out the full range of benefits of water funds and why they're really crucial. And also the majority of you thought that it used jargon in terms of the ways that language worked. So there was more to be done in terms of making it accessible for some of the less expert audiences we deal with. Also, it showed us that there is a real appetite for this work. 82% of your colleagues that we spoke to agreed that they would benefit from a shared framework to guide how they communicate about water funds. So this told us that there was a clear need to change and started to give us a picture of what needed to happen. So after conducting some more interviews and talking in more depth to some of your colleagues in terms of how they would use the framework and what their priorities were, we settled on some key principles for the communications framework and toolkit. So to run through these very quickly, because I think there are some interesting tensions here. We needed to offer a short and simple definition that could be used anywhere and easily understood by anyone, but then it had to be a framework that also allowed us to add in extra depth and kind of technical information for the expert audiences that you work with all the time, the kind of the people who really understand the policy space where you need to be able to get into the detail. It needed to allow for that as well. But despite that, the upfront, the accessible, short and simple definition that we used had to avoid jargon as much as possible, so it could be understood by everyone. It needed to center on nature. We have the Nature Conservancy, so that's obviously really important, but making sure that that really sat at the front of all of the language was something that really came through when we spoke to you about making it authentically Nature Conservancy and kind of fitting with your overall identity. And you needed to tell a consistent global story that still should be applicable to all water funds in their many different forms and their many different approaches. Finally, we needed to explain why water funds were so crucial using key global facts. So no matter who it was anywhere in the world, we still had a thread of an evidence base for why this was so important and urgent and why it exists. But then we also needed space for local proof points so that each water fund could really articulate why it was that their specific area had an urgent need for a nature-based solution to dealing with their water issues there. So that was kind of the overall principles for the toolkit that we had. We then took a look in more detail at some of the language that we used. So on this slide here, if we just flip over to the next one, the specialists in communication and also some other of your colleagues within the Nature Conservancy helped us identify some areas where we could simplify the language to make it more accessible to some of the people who aren't as up to date with some of the specific water funds language as you are. So this slide shows some of the keywords and phrases which we've tried to avoid in the shortened version, which you'll see soon, called the messaging grid. Most importantly though, in no way is this saying that we can't use these words or this language, just that we'll try and avoid using it at the first level of communication while we're bringing people in and telling them what a water fund is and why it matters. But there's absolutely room to still keep using this very specific, very important language for what water funds are and how they work. Kind of once we've got past that and we're talking to people who are on board with what we're saying and why it matters. So with this feedback in mind, we worked with a working group of your colleagues to build up what we call a messaging grid with a definition for water funds, why they matter and how to speak about them, while creating room for it to be locally tailored to each individual water fund.
Right. So now, in this section, we will try to achieve two things. The first one is to introduce you to the concept of message grid. Some of you are very familiar with it, and for others, it's a new tool. And ourselves will try to avoid jargon. So I think it's good if we clarify the concept. And the second thing is to run you through the actual message grid, which is, I think, what a few of us are waiting. So. Kit has just explained the methodology that we used to reach that point where we were in a position to confidently starting to write the message grid. And what appeared as important was to focusing on messages for targeted audiences. So basically, there are a few things that are the reality, the diverse realities of water funds, which is there is a diversity of water funds. It's a universal concept, but has different reality. It's located in different geographies, and we cannot alter geographies. So we took that into account from day one, and they also operate in different social, political environments. The different water funds have a wide range of shareholders with different interests. So some of them will care about the safety of water. Others will be more interested in the profitability, the protection of the environment. And it was clear from the very beginning that all of these concepts had to be central and equally treated within the final product, the message grid. And of course, there is a multitude of spokespeople. So it's a concept that has an international potential. However, that said, the priority when communicating the concept is to demonstrate the overall strategy behind the water funds and what sets it apart. So basically, when we talk about strategy, water funds is a universal concept, and not taking into account this universal reality creates some sort of waste when you communicate the concept. So if you in charge of a water fund in Africa, it's an important point for the audience to know that there are water funds worldwide, and that from all that experience, the people can benefit from all that experience. So on the right side of the slide, you can see two pyramids. And what we did was to move from the one on the left to the one on the right. So the one on the left shows that what happens when you communicate, starting from the different realities to reach the universal concept. And what we think is really important is to start what these water funds have in common. So the next slide shows you a template of the grid we've designed because it's tailored for the concept of water funds. So basically, we start from the key facts, a problem statement, and we then move to a solution, because this is how we understand water funds. They are a solution. So as Bianca said, within this message grid, some of these language have gone through multiple process and have been confirmed as final. And there is also some room for flexibility, so it reflects the reality of your different water funds. So the way to understand the solution is that it's a central idea which sets the tone. It can be mentioned several times during an interview or a talk. So basically, when you give an interview, the solution is if the person you're talking to, which can be a journalist or a potential business partner or people from the community, the solution is what you want them to remember. It's the most important aspect of the water fund. And then there is the pitch, which is the summary one would give if they only had 30 seconds to talk. So basically, the way you can think about it is if you take a lift and you go from the ground floor to the 7th floor and you have 30 seconds with someone that is really important, then what you want to say is the pitch. And then you have several messages, which we will go through into details in a moment. At the bottom, you have the proof points, the proof. This is extremely important in the context of water funds, because every single water fund will have a different proof point. We'll use different proof points to sustain the argument. And this is what will make your own water fund unique, which within the global frame. So this is the next slide is a way of illustrating what we were saying. For example, when Kit said we should avoid or try to avoid as much as possible to use some specific jargon, we said it's on a discussion at level 1 to start the discussion. But then obviously there is room to be more specific. The more expert the people you are talking to, the more in details we'll have to go to. And these message grids have been designed in such a way that it's flexible enough for you to be able to use them when, with a more complex vocabulary at some point with different stakeholders. And now here is the message grid. So as mentioned again, some of these words here have gone through multiple process and are some sort of definitive and final, but also there are other boxes that are much more flexible. And now I will run you through the different component of this message grid, but every time making clear what is universal and what can be more specific. So it all starts with a problem statement because, again, water funds are a solution. And one example, but this is flexible, is to say that by 2045, the world's urban population will increase to 6 billion, 1.5 acres of forest are cut down every second, and 40% of the land around the world's water sources is degraded. So these are proof points which lead to the conclusion that there is an urgent need to mobilize the power of nature to meet water security challenges in a sustainable way. So this is specific to some context. Obviously, you can change the proof point and reach a different conclusion, but the solution will always be water funds unite individuals, the public, and the private sector around the common goal of securing water for communities by protecting the lands around water sources in a way that promotes sustainable economic development. Now, a key concept here is the audience. Who are you talking to? And we believe that this is the right solution because it talks to all of your audiences. Now, when it comes to the pitch, so if you're in the lift, what you want to say is, water funds empower multiple stakeholders to mobilize the power of nature to secure water for communities around the world. And there is much more to say, but it's all about making sure that it's organized in such a way that it's efficient and works well. So we have distinguished different key messages taking an audience-based approach. So the first key message focuses on governance and the different convening mechanisms. The second one is working with nature for water security. So obviously, we are talking about the Nature Conservancy, so we want to bring the nature at the center of this grid, and then we want to show the benefits for all, and this is also something that is at the, in the Nature Conservancy's DNA. So to go into more details now, the first pillar is water funds are collective efforts enabling multiple stakeholders to be involved in water security. So it focuses on the water security, and this is why I was talking about different audiences. We believe that there is, for all water funds, the idea of water security is central. And then you have supporting message. So the first one is they unite people to create holistic and effective solutions to a shared water challenge. And when you read it and you use it, you can then use proof points. Obviously, these proof points will be tailored to your own water fund. The second supporting message is that they represent a more inclusive approach to water security. Everyone has a say in and the responsibility for decisions and management of water. And again, you can illustrate that with your own proof points taken from your own reality. And then they create a mechanism to finance and manage long-term solutions sustainable to water security. So this is for the first pillar that focused on governance and convening mechanism. The second one, which is more about the nature for water security, we said that these initiatives focus on mobilizing the power of nature to improve water quality and supply. So the first supporting message is that healthy watershed, and then again, we've explained what is a watershed. For most of you, it's a crystal clear concept, but this has been designed thinking a lot about the people you are talking to. So we say the lands around streams, lakes, and rivers, and it's just an example on how to clarify jargon, provide many benefits to communities, ecosystems, and cities. Then we have water funds work by using scientific analysis to optimize the way watersheds are managed. I believe this is a very important one, not only because it's at the center of the page, but also because it talks about scientific analysis And I think this is a very strong element for water funds, something that makes you stand out. And obviously you will have proof points here again based on your own realities. And then you go to working with nature delivers cost effective. I think it's really important, and during the interviews it came quite often, and sustainable, crucial again, solutions, and can enhance the resilience of man-made infrastructure. So again, for all of these supporting messages, you will have your own proof points. And the third pillar is this approach to water security benefits nature, communities, and businesses, both up and downstream. So I think this is quite an inclusive one, and the split here was between the up and the downstream communities, because these are different sort of stakeholders for you with different priorities. So we start with the upstream community, saying that water funds work with people living upstream to help them manage watersheds, improving the productivity and resilience of their lands. And then we move to the downstream community, which is water security is improved for downstream communities, cities and businesses. This supports social development and reduces economic risk. So here you have the social aspect. We talked about a variety of socio-political realities, but talks also about the business aspects. Finally, water funds improve the health of watersheds and therefore the biodiversity in the area. And I think this is a crucial concept, especially with the importance of biodiversity next year. Sorry. So that's it for the message grid, and we will be obviously in a position to answer your questions. But something that is also very important. So we wanted to, let's say, better equipped the concept of water funds in terms of messaging. The idea is to be more consistent worldwide. But obviously, it's important to also equip this new messaging with a brand that reflects that the universal concept, but also your different realities and water funds. So this is why we've created a toolkit, which is basically the idea is to provide materials to communicate about water funds clearly and consistently, both internally and externally, with room for adaptation on a regional and local basis. And we have, after that slide, a few examples that will be shared with you. The first example is a case study template. So this goes without saying that all your case studies will be different, but it's also for you to see that there is a template, and that if everyone is using the same template, then we equip that concept with more consistency. The press release again. So all of these element of the toolkit are flexible enough for you, for example, to add your own logo. So on the press release, well, it's a template, and then you have the infographics and the PowerPoint template. We know PowerPoint is a tool that many of you use for pitches or when communicating about the concept. So there is no control on the content here, but there is a brand definitely with elements that bring more consistency. So now, oops, sorry, this is coming back. So we wanted to go through the next steps with you as well. Obviously, the presentation and message grid will be circulated in the following days after these webinars. You will also receive templates of the different components of the toolkit. You should feel free to follow via email if you have any specific questions or requests. Also, feel free to ask them now. There are plans for language translations in French, Spanish, and Portuguese to be completed in the beginning of 2020. And basically, the message is that you should just keep doing what you're doing, but just using the new tool and new language. And this is some sort of soft launch. And that's it, I think. So thank you, everyone. and give the floor now back to Bianca.
Thank you, everyone. I will go ahead and field the Q&A questions now. If you have any, now is a good time to write some in the chat box. If there aren't any that are coming to mind right now at the moment, you can always feel free to reach out to me and I will direct your question in the right direction.
And there was one that came to me, just someone sent it through the private chat, which is worth sharing with the group, which was looking at the questions, the jargon, you know, the particular phrases and terms that people flagged as being a bit jargony. We're not saying don't use those, because a lot of them are very important to how we describe our work. It's just they are not, we avoided using them in the entry point for discussions. We don't want to necessarily put people off or lose them straight away, but we absolutely realise they're important as you start, those discussions start evolving. But you know, avoid them in the first instance, but of course, we're not saying eradicate them completely. And thanks for raising that.
Thanks, Bianca. And we'll just give a few more minutes to see if any other questions come up.
Hey, Bianca, this is Andrea. I'd actually like to reverse the question thing for a second here too, if people would like to think about this. What challenges might people see in using these materials, knowing we have lots of different communicators in lots of different corners of the organization? So I'd love to hear from the communications professionals or Water Funds practitioners on the call as well. You know, you have something to work from. There's been a lot of work on the language. There's some tools there. What else would people see as challenges moving forward?
Okay, so I've received a few more questions privately. Bianca, this seems like a good question for you. What is the proposal for where this toolkit will be stored internally so it can be accessed by all?
That's a great question. Thank you. It will be in Box. So we will be sharing a link to Box that we will also link to from Connect. So it will be accessible to internal and external Water Funds practitioners.
Thanks, Bianca. And another question is, were there any discussion in the external interviews about whether simplified messages will oversell the benefits of Water Funds?
Kit, I think that's one for you.
I think it's not something that directly came up. I think the external partners that we spoke to were very positive about the idea of Water Funds and were keen to have something that made a very robust argument in their favour. There wasn't anything that we had that came through in specific responses concerning that this had gone too far, especially with the text that we've got here. I don't think that's to say it's not something we should ever be concerned about, but the feeling that we had come through from the people that we spoke to as part of this session was that having something that they could, having these kind of arguments that were kind of quite clear and very forthright in terms of what it is that's strong about them, what it is that benefits, is something that generally helps their job in terms of making the argument for why these are good and important as people who are already sold in.
Great, thank you. And there was another comment in the chat. It seems that there are a number of messages about what Water Funds represent, but not about what it is. So the question here is, how should we answer what a water fund is?
Yeah, and I think that's a very not only good but important question, and I would approach it in some sort of chronological way. What we want first is to explain the concept, and I think that what it's meant by what water funds represents. If anyone is asking then what it is, then we touch on the diverse reality of the concept. So we see it as a second step, and each water fund will have a slightly different answer, because if we are talking about facility, then facilities are different. If we are talking about endowment, then there is a difference as well for all of these concepts, and this can come at the proof point when clarifying the different key messages, or it's a second stage discussion where more jargon can be allowed, but the fact that they are asking what it is already some sort of victory.
Thanks, Alex. And another question, did you test or talk about any call to action language or ways for people to get engaged, turning the messaging into action?
Thanks. That's not something we tested directly as part of this project. We were very much focused on a definition and defining what water funds were as a solution. I think one of the things that did come through really clearly through the different interviews we were conducting with people in different countries was that what types of language and what types of arguments motivate different areas of people and different types of stakeholder varied really strongly. We spoke to people in areas where the fundamental call to action was about nature, it was about animals, it was about the importance for water funds in kind of maintaining a role for nature in the context of a growing global population. There were other areas where it was fundamentally water security above everything, or how much we could integrate with urban populations and kind of the matching of green and grey. So I think in terms of how you would tailor this in terms of engaging people from different audiences, that's where we would suggest building in your own proof points and considering which of the key messages you bring most to the fore when speaking to different audiences will be the thing that's most important in terms of how you apply this set of tools. But then we also completely recognize that this will quite often be something that will sit alongside calls to action, or if you're speaking to audiences who are already very, very familiar with what water funds are and why they're important, it might be that actually you're just giving calls to action straight to the audience without necessarily needing to draw on what we have here, if you're already speaking to people who are very engaged. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Bianca, this seems like a question for you. Are there currently toolkits available that help internal or external practitioners implement water funds in terms of developing partnerships, adopting policies, or some of the scientific methodologies?
I think I'd like to pass that question to Emily Simmons, who I believe is on the line.
Sorry, Bianca, could you repeat the question?
I'll go ahead and repeat it. So the question is, are there currently toolkits available that help internal or external practitioners to implement water funds in terms of developing partnerships, adopting policies, or some of the scientific methodologies?
I mean, there's a whole suite of amazing resources on the Water Funds toolbox from an internal perspective as well. Like the Water Funds Network has, since 2014, kept a library of all recorded webinars and materials that I can certainly provide links to. So the answer is yes. There's sometimes a challenge of making sure that what's readily available is the most up to date. But please do reach out to me, and I'm happy to navigate through all the plethora of resources to deliver on what you're hopefully looking for.
Thanks so much for jumping in, Emily. And I see, thank you, Lisa, for posting a link to the Water Funds Toolbox in the chat. Another question now for Alex and Kit. Is there any early information on how well these messaging boxes are actually resonating with different audience groups?
Alex and Kit, I can't hear you. I don't know if anyone else can.
Hello?
Hi, Alex. We can
I'm
hear
sorry.
you now.
Apologies. So the answer is yes and no. Yes, because we've involved as much as possible the different stakeholders, shareholders, external people while doing the research and designing the final product. So in that sense, yes, we've taken their feedback into account, but we've not pursued, and we're just rolling out the tool with you guys today. And obviously we will be open to feedback once you have more of a sense of how are the audience reacting.
Yeah, this is Nathan. That was my question. So just as a follow-on, I mean, do you want to, how Bianca, do you want to stay informed about how well this messaging is working for us as we actually try to use this with different audience groups?
Oh, that's a brilliant question. We don't have a formal system for feedback, but we definitely want it. And yeah, any information on how it's resonating, I think probably the best thing is to just keep me posted, if that's all right. And as I said at the beginning, this is live and we can update it on a regular basis, and getting external feedback will be a very important part of that. So for now, just channel it through me, and please make sure you do. That's a great question.
Thanks for that, Nathan. And I see Mickey has a comment here regarding jargon and the term water fund itself. I don't see a question here, but just a general comment about the name Water Fund. Perhaps the question here is if there's any discussions in changing the name itself. Bianca, this seems like a question for you.
I'm actually hoping that Andrea might also weigh in on this. It's an ongoing question about whether the term water funds is as helpful as it could be. Certainly something that we consider as part of this. We don't have a clear direction at the moment, but that discussion is also live, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we have a little bit of a challenge in that, you know, Water Fund doesn't say exactly what we're about, and it confuses people. I think when you say fund, they think this is a financial instrument only. So it drives like a mental image towards a mutual fund or something that people are putting money in and getting money out. In fact, there are things in the Nature Conservancy that by law have to be called a water fund because they are impact investment deals and they are regulated and they have to say water fund. So it's even internally confusing sometimes, the name. So there's that. On the flip side, there's a certain amount of brand now around this that externally people know this is TNC's thing, you know, that water funds are what we do. We do lots of other things. We try to make sure when we're communicating externally, talk about the breadth of TNC's work in watershed conservation. And then there's this approach that is about connecting communities to their catchments that is called the Water Fund. And so I struggle with that. I'd be really interested, honestly, to explore that more in a systematic way. What are the pros and cons of continuing with this title or evolving it in some way into something that is still recognizable to our brand, but is maybe keeps us away from the downside risk of fund. So maybe that's stage 2 or stage 3 of our journey here with you, Bianca, is to consider that as a next project, you know, to analyze the risks or the opportunities of changing slightly the name. I also wanted to thank Alejandro Calvache for his answer to my question about the challenge, which I'm sure many people share. So maybe, Alessandra, if we could focus on Alejandro for a second.
Excuse me. Okay, so I'll go ahead and read Alejandro's comment. His challenge is effectively communicate the unified key messages from water funds to completely different educated audiences, public agencies, private businesses, etc. Thank you for that answer, Alejandro. And
just maybe on that specific point here, this is the whole purpose of the new message grid. And if there is one objective here, is to make sure that we are effectively communicating the concept to a very diverse audience. This is something we've taken into account from the very beginning of this work a year ago. We understand that you're talking, so to be clear, we are talking about different audiences, but even when we are talking about, for example, public agencies, we are talking about public agencies all around the world. So the diversity is everywhere here. And this is why we've done that work about simplifying the language, saying what we want to say. Sounds obvious, but sometimes it's a challenge. Being transparent, and this is also another illustration of our comments regarding jargon words. We're not trying to say you should never use these words. We're just saying that every time you use a jargon word, it's a word that can be understood very well by a specific audience, not by everyone. So this is why we've tried to clean up a little bit this message grid from these sort of words, so it applies to more people, not only in in the different sectors, but in the different parts of the world. And then once the concept is clear, then we can have a more expert level of discussion. Hope that clarifies. And obviously, this is when where we need feedback actually to make sure it works.
Thank you, Alex. I've had one more question come in for you. Is it possible to share who the external interviewers were and how they were selected?
This is something that we can have a look at and see and come back to you later. When we do this, we have a specific protocol to make sure that people feel confident when they are talking. So we need to look closely at the protocol before giving an answer.
Thanks, Alex. Another question and comment. This webinar has been helpful for communicating the concept of water funds, but are there any specific challenges in communicating the nuances of particular regional experiences, considering the variety of ecosystems that can support water funds? And on top of that, are there any sensitivities around talking about the role of communities involved?
All right. So regarding the geographic challenges, yes, and this is something we worked on from the beginning. We've interviewed people from all around the world, and you would be surprised to see that what some of you consider as their main challenge is not a challenge at all for other people. So the idea of this message grid is to address all of these challenges, and I think simplification is one of the answer. Regarding the sensitivity for local communities, this is a point that's been touched as well during the interviews. It's crucial, it's really important, but this is extremely specific. So there is no general answer, and I think you will know what is sensitive in your own context and what is not.
Can I just make a comment on that? This is Andrea. I want to underscore that it's really important to not overlook the importance of talking about both communities. We put this in the message framework here, the messaging architecture, but the benefits to both communities, both the community that may be working on the land, landholders, landowners, agriculture, and their livelihoods and their community resilience is a really important outcome of what we're doing in water funds, as is those downstream users of water. And I would only recommend to be sure that your particular geography, that you are thinking about both communities and not forgetting that the balance, the mutual benefit between those communities is really fundamental and core to what we're doing here. So thanks for the question about the sensitivity of communities. Every community is going to be different in what their needs and interests are, or trigger points, but mutual benefit between communities is very important, I think, across the board.
To build on that, Andrea, it comes back to the way you should read this message grid, and totally to your point, you read the message grid from the top to the bottom. So something maybe we should have said earlier, do never read supporting messages without having read the key message. And here the key message, it's clear, it's this approach to water security benefits nature, communities and businesses both up and downstream. And then you can be more specific on the upstream or the downstream, depending on your concept and your issues at the moment. But yeah.
Thank you so much. I don't see any more questions. I'll give another minute to see if any more will come in. I'm aware that we have about 6 minutes left on the call. All right, well, if that's it, then I guess we can wrap up a bit early. Thank you so much, Andrea and Bianca, Alex and Kit, for the presentation today, and thank you all very much for joining. If there's any questions after this call, please feel free to reach out. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. It was very informative.
Bye.
Useful tool. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks all.